My son and his wife called the house I built with my husband a pile of wood on wasted land and tried to sell it from under me. They thought I was a guest in their lives. They forgot I was still the one who owned the foundation they stood on. My true story from Vermont. My son and his wife called the house I built with my husband a pile of wood on wasted land and tried to sell it from under me. They thought I was a guest in their lives. They forgot I was still the one who owned the foundation they stood on. The silence after a man's heart stops beating is a different kind of quiet. For 47 years, the old house in the Vermont hills had been filled with the sound of my husband, of his footsteps on the oak floors, his laughter echoing against the plaster walls. Now there was only the whisper of the wind through the pines and the steady, lonely ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My name is Eleanor, and for a lifetime this house was not just a structure of wood and nails. It was a promise, a living thing. We had bought the land when it was nothing but a field of wildflowers, and with our own hands we raised these walls. Every beam held a memory. Every window framed a season of our life together. It was where we brought home our son Michael and watched him grow from a boy chasing fireflies in the yard to a man with a family of his own. But time, as it does, began to fray the edges of my strength. A tremor found its way into my hands, making it difficult to hold a teacup steady. My steps became slower, more deliberate, and the long Vermont winters felt colder, more isolating than ever before. It was then that Michael and his wife Tanya began their campaign of concern. They would drive up from the city, their car too clean for our dusty country roads, and fill my quiet kitchen with their loud, anxious love. "Mom, you can't be rattling around in this big old place by yourself," Michael would say. His eyes filled with a sincerity I wanted desperately to believe. Tanya would nod, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my arm. "We worry about you constantly. Please come live with us. Let us take care of you." Their words were a sweet, persuasive melody, and I, a woman who had spent her life nurturing, found it difficult to refuse the offer of being nurtured in return. I agreed. I packed a single suitcase with my most essential things, believing I was entrusting my home, my life's work, into the loving hands of my only son. I saw it as a temporary retreat, a brief chapter before I returned to the familiar comfort of these walls. I imagined them caring for the house, preserving it as a sanctuary of memories for our grandchildren, a place where the family's roots would remain anchored. The house was the foundation, and I believed they understood that. The day I left, I stood on the porch for a long moment, my hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of the railing. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and impending snow. I looked out at the rolling hills, the same view that had greeted me every morning for nearly 5 decades. When Michael started the car, I took one last look back at the house, a solid, steadfast guardian of my past. But as we drove away, a cold, unfamiliar feeling settled in my chest, a quiet whisper of doubt that coiled around my heart. It was a faint, discordant note in the symphony of their reassurances, a shadow of foreboding I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was just the sorrow of leaving. I didn't know then that it was the sound of a promise beginning to crack. I was leaving the shelter of my life and walking into a story that had long since erased my name from the script. Their house was not a home. It was a magazine spread. Everything was white and gray and chrome cold to the touch and silent. There were no photographs on the walls, no worn armchairs, no sense of a life lived within its perfect, sterile lines. It smelled of bleach and secrets. My room, which they called the guest suite, was at the far end of the hall, small and impersonal, with a window that looked out onto a concrete patio. My suitcase of belongings felt like a foreign intrusion, and I found myself putting my few photographs away in a drawer as if they were contraband. I went from homeowner to helper, from mother to maid in the space of a single car ride. I had become a tolerated ghost in a house that felt more like a waiting room than a home. This was the beginning of the ledger of wrongs, a quiet accounting of disrespect that I kept in the ledger of my mind. Tanya's cruelty was a masterpiece of passive aggression delivered in sweet, concerned tones. "Oh, Eleanor, that old cardigan is so charming. But let's get you something a bit more modern, shall we?" she'd say, her smile never reaching her eyes. My simple tastes in food were an inconvenience. One evening, as I reached for the teapot, my favorite rose-patterned teacup, the last of a set my husband had given me, slipped from her grasp as she was helping me wash it. It shattered on the cold tile floor. "Oh, clumsy me," she'd sighed, sweeping the pieces into a dustpan with an air of finality. "Don't worry, we have plenty of mugs." I said nothing. I simply watched a piece of my history being thrown into the trash. The kitchen table, once the heart of my own home, became a stage for my erasure. More often than not, I would find a plate left for me on the counter, a simpler meal than what they were having, with a note. "We had to eat early, Mom. A work thing." I would sit alone in the silent kitchen, eating my solitary meal, while the sound of their laughter and conversation drifted from the dining room. They were not erasing me with cruelty, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but with the quiet, constant friction of being made to feel like a burden, like dead weight. And Michael, my son, was the silent architect of this cruelty. He had his father's eyes, but none of his fire, none of his conviction. He sat through Tanya's subtle jabs and my quiet humiliations with his head bowed over his phone, his silence a shield he used to protect his own comfort. When I tried to speak to him to ask about the old house, he was vague and dismissive. "Everything's fine, Mom. Don't you worry about a thing." But I saw the way he avoided my gaze, the way his shoulders tensed when I entered a room. He was a stranger to me now, a man who chose the easy peace of complicity over the difficult work of honor. Love without respect, I was learning, is not love at all. It is a cage. And I was becoming more aware of the bars with each passing day. My silence was not surrender. It was observation. And I was observing everything. The truth, when it comes, rarely arrives with a formal announcement. It slips in through a crack in the door, a whisper carried on the sterile, air-conditioned currents of a home that was never mine. It was a Tuesday evening. I had retreated to my room after another solitary dinner, the silence of my own company, a familiar, if lonely, companion. The door hadn't latched properly, a small oversight on my part, or perhaps a careless one on theirs. Through that sliver of open space, their voices traveled down the long, empty hallway, low at first, then gaining a confident clarity. They thought I was asleep. They thought I was deaf to their ambitions. Tanya's voice came first, sharp and dismissive. "Michael, we have to do something about that place. It's so outdated, it's honestly just ugly. The photos the realtor sent are embarrassing." My house. She was talking about my house, a place she had visited only a handful of times always, with a look of faint disgust on her face. I expected my son to defend it, to offer even a token resistance born of childhood sentiment. But his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I know. It needs a lot of work before we can even think about listing it. Listing it. The words hung in the air cold and heavy. They weren't preserving it. They were pricing it. Then came the blow that shattered everything. Tanya laughed, a short, brittle sound with no humor in it. Work, Michael, honey. It's not worth putting a dime into that pile of wood sitting on wasted land. The value is in the acreage. We sell the land, knock down the shack, and we can finally get that villa near the city. Think of it. A pool, a boat, a pile of wood on wasted land. The words struck me with the force of a physical slap. My home, the repository of my entire life, reduced to an obstacle, a pile of inconvenient lumber standing in the way of their luxurious future. They spoke of the money as if it were already theirs, discussing interest rates and floor plans, their voices giddy with greed. They never once mentioned me. I was not a person with feelings or a history tied to that land. I was a legal problem to be managed. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her, Tanya said with chilling confidence. She probably doesn't even remember her own name half the time. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The shock had built a wall inside me, brick by solid brick. The pain was not a hot, searing grief, but a sudden, profound coldness, a clarity that froze the last vestiges of my naive trust. It was not just a betrayal. It was an erasure. They were planning to bulldoze my past, to liquidate my memories for a boat and a swimming pool. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The soft, forgiving mother who had moved into her son's home, seeking care, began to recede. In her place, a different woman began to surface. A woman who had been a court secretary for 30 years. A woman who understood that paper doesn't forget. A quiet, observant woman who was now awake and who now understood exactly what she had to do. The game had changed, and they had no idea they were even playing. That night, sleep was a distant country I could not reach. I lay in the sterile darkness of the guest room, the thin blanket pulled up to my chin, and I did not cry. Instead, I remembered. Memory, I have found, is a form of power. It is the one thing they cannot take from you, the one thing they cannot bulldoze. My mind became a courtroom, and I began to present my evidence. I remembered working double shifts at the library to help pay for Michael's tuition, the scent of old paper clinging to my clothes when I came home late at night. I remembered selling my own mother's jewelry, a string of pearls I had treasured, to make the down payment on his first car. I remembered the countless nights spent by his bedside, a cool cloth on his feverish forehead, the world outside the small circle of my lamp, silent and still. These were not just memories. They were entries in a ledger of sacrifice, debts of love that had been forgotten and devalued. Then my mind turned to the house. I remembered the day my husband and I signed the papers for the land, our hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. I could almost smell the sawdust in the air as we worked alongside the builders, hammering nails and painting walls our laughter, the first sound to truly fill the empty space. We had poured our youth, our savings, our very selves into that soil, into that foundation. It wasn't a pile of wood. It was a life. It was the physical manifestation of our partnership, a testament to a love built to last. It was the shelter we had created for the very son who now saw it as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated. He had forgotten. Or perhaps he had chosen to forget. He had forgotten the foundation upon which his entire life was built. In his rush to acquire a new, shiny future, he was willing to auction off his past. The grief I felt was not for the potential loss of the house. It was for the loss of my son's character. I didn't lose a son to death or distance. I lost him to apathy, to a casual modern greed that saw no value in history, no currency in honor. The man he had become was a stranger to me, and as I lay there, a single powerful thought began to form, repeating itself with the steady rhythm of the clock in the hall. Paper doesn't forget. People forget. Children forget. But paper holds the ink. It holds the signatures, the dates, the legal truths that cannot be erased by convenience or desire. They thought my memories were worthless, sentimental clutter from a bygone era. They had no idea that my memory, combined with the documented facts of the past, was about to become the most formidable weapon they had ever faced. My silence from that moment on was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the strategic quiet of a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They mistook my stillness for surrender. It was a grave mistake. I was not a parasite. I was the foundation. And they were about to be reminded of that fact. The next morning, I rose before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival. The cold clarity that had settled in my heart the night before had not dissipated. It had solidified into a calm, quiet purpose. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark dress and my most sensible shoes. There was a journey to be made. I moved through the silent sleeping house like a ghost, my footsteps making no sound on the polished floors. I slipped out the front door into the pre-dawn chill of the Vermont morning, the air so crisp it felt sharp in my lungs. I did not call a taxi. I walked the half-mile to the bus stop, the rhythmic crunch of my shoes on the gravel shoulder, the only sound in the stillness. The bus arrived with a hiss of its air brakes, its warm, brightly lit interior, a stark contrast to the gray dawn. I sat by a window, my handbag clutched tightly in my lap, and watched the world wake up. The other passengers were a quiet collection of early morning travelers, nurses on their way to a shift, construction workers with tired eyes, students bent over books. We were all on our own journeys, each of us carrying our own silent burdens. My destination was not a place of emotion or sentiment. It was the county records office, a stark, functional building in the center of town. It was a place of facts, a place where truth was documented in black and white. The office smelled of old paper and floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving light on the rows of metal filing cabinets. It was a place where sentiment held no currency, where the only thing that mattered was what was written down, signed and stamped. I approached the counter, my posture straight, my expression calm and dignified. The clerk was a young woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. She looked at me without pity, without condescension, but with a simple, direct respect that felt like a drink of cool water after weeks in a desert. I would like to request copies of the deed and property title for the land registered under the name Eleanor J. Warren. I said, my voice steady and clear. She nodded, typed my name into her computer, and then disappeared into the back room. I waited, my heart beating a steady, resolute rhythm against my ribs. She returned a few minutes later with a thick manila folder. The rustle of the papers as she pulled them out was the sound of my history being brought back into the light. She laid them on the counter before me, the original deed, the property title, the tax records. And there it was, the forgotten truth they had so carelessly dismissed. The title had never been transferred. After my husband passed, full ownership had reverted to me, and it had remained there untouched for all these years. My name, Eleanor J. Warren, was printed in bold, indelible ink. This was not revenge. This was reality. The clerk made fresh certified copies for me, the official stamp pressing into the paper with a satisfying thud. I held in my hands the tangible proof of my life, the undeniable evidence of my ownership. This was the weapon I would use, not out of anger, but out of a deep and abiding need to restore what was right. I tucked the documents safely into my handbag. They felt heavy, a quiet weight of certainty against my side. For the first time in months, I felt the ground firm beneath my feet. I was no longer a guest. I was a landowner. My next stop was not a place of public record, but a sanctuary of private counsel. The law office of Walter Benedetti was just 2 blocks from the courthouse, a quiet, respectable establishment with his name written in elegant gold leaf on the door. Walter had been my husband's oldest friend and our family's lawyer for over 40 years. He was a man of quiet integrity with a mind as sharp as a tack and a heart grounded in old-fashioned decency. His office was a haven of order and reason, smelling of old books' leather and freshly brewed coffee. It was the absolute antithesis of the cold, sterile environment I had been living in. Walter greeted me with a warm, concerned smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a comforting baritone, "it's good to see you, but I sense this isn't just a social call." He led me to a comfortable leather armchair opposite his large mahogany desk. I sat down, placed my handbag on the floor beside me, and for the first time, I laid out the whole ugly story. I spoke calmly, without tears or melodrama, presenting the facts as I had observed them, as if I were a witness testifying in court. I told him about their words, their plans, their casual dismissal of my entire life. He listened patiently, his hands steepled on his desk, his expression shifting from concern to a quiet, righteous anger that burned in his eyes on my behalf. He did not interrupt. When I finished, I reached into my bag and placed the certified copies of the deed and title on his desk. He picked them up, his movements deliberate, and studied them for a long moment. He traced my name on the title with his forefinger. "Well, Eleanor," he said, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. "They can plan all they want. This is ironclad. This land, this house, it's yours. Solely and completely. Legally, they can't so much as repaint the front door without your permission." His words were a powerful affirmation, a legal validation of the truth I already held in my heart. He explained the ramifications without my signature on a transfer of deed. Any sale they attempted would be fraudulent and void. But Walter, ever the strategist, suggested we go one step further. "They are counting on you being confused or intimidated," he said. "Let's remove that possibility entirely." He advised me to place a legal restriction, a lien against the property. He explained that this would act as a fortress wall around my ownership. It would be a public legal notice that no sale, refinancing, or transfer of title could occur without my explicit in-person consent, a consent that would have to be reviewed and notarized right here in his office. This was my all-rise moment. It was the point where I transitioned from a silent victim to an active plaintiff in the defense of my own life. The language became procedural as Walter drafted the necessary paperwork. I read every line, the legal jargon no longer intimidating, but empowering. When he was finished, he handed me a pen. I signed my name, Eleanor J. Warren, with a steady, resolute hand. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly on a piece of notarized paper to be filed away in a courthouse vault, waiting patiently for its moment to be revealed. I had built a legal wall around my home, and my family had no idea they were about to run right into it. I returned to their house that afternoon, the fortress of my quiet power. The notarized deed, the lien agreement, the undeniable truth tucked securely in my handbag. The atmosphere inside was thick with a tension only I could fully understand. It was a stage perfectly set for the final act of a play they didn't even know they were in. From that day forward, I watched them with new, clear eyes. I was the silent observer, a ghost at the feast of their ambition, and the dramatic irony of my position was a heavy, secret comfort. Their words of affection, once a source of comfort, now sounded hollow and false, like poorly rehearsed lines. Their smiles felt like masks, barely concealing the greed that swam beneath the surface. I would sit in my armchair in the living room, pretending to read and watch Tanya as she scrolled endlessly through real estate websites on her laptop. She would sigh with longing at pictures of sprawling, sterile villas with infinity pools that overlooked city skylines. I saw the future she was trying to steal. I heard Michael on the phone with mortgage brokers, his voice low and conspiratorial, discussing interest rates and closing costs. They were so close, they believed, to cashing in the lottery ticket of my life's work. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of lies, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire foundation was mine. I continued my routine, making myself small, an unassuming piece of old furniture in the corner of their modern lives. I washed the dishes, folded the laundry, and nodded politely when they spoke to me. My quietness, which they had once interpreted as compliance, they now saw as the gentle, welcome decline of old age. They believed I was fading, that my mind was becoming as frail as my body. They saw my silence as senility, a convenient blank slate upon which they could write their own story. They mistook my silence for surrender. But my silence was a coiled spring. It was the quiet before the storm. Every cloying, patronizing question. How are you feeling today? Mom. Are you comfortable? Was a fresh entry in the ledger of their deceit. I kept my handbag with me at all times now. It sat on the floor beside my chair, a quiet, unassuming sentinel. It rested on my lap when I sat at the kitchen table. At night, it was on the nightstand beside my bed. The physical weight of the documents inside was a constant reminder of my resolve, a tangible connection to my own power. The power dynamic in that house had already shifted irrevocably and completely, but I was the only one who knew it. They moved with the confident arrogance of people who believe they hold all the cards, unaware that the single most important card in the deck was resting safely in the bottom of a worn leather handbag. They saw an old woman with nowhere else to go. They were about to learn they were living with the one person who could decide if they had a home at all. Their world was perfectly balanced on the edge of a cliff, and they were dancing oblivious right at the precipice. I simply waited. Patience, after all, was a virtue I had spent a lifetime perfecting. The day I knew was coming arrived on a Thursday. It came as I expected, cloaked in a performance of kindness so theatrical it was almost comical. After dinner, as I sat in my usual chair in the living room, Michael and Tanya approached me together. It was a coordinated effort, a pincer movement of feigned affection. Their faces were arranged in careful expressions of sweet, familial concern. Tanya was holding a clipboard, a stack of crisp papers, neatly aligned, a sleek silver pen clipped to the top. The props for their final scene were in place. They sat on either side of me, hemming me in with their solicitude. Tanya placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch light and proprietary. Mom Michael began, his voice soft and placating, the voice he used when he wanted something. "We have some routine papers here. We just need you to sign. It's for the property taxes on the old house. Just some boring government stuff to keep everything in order and save us all some money." His words were a carefully crafted lie designed to sound mundane and harmless. Tanya chimed in, her voice like sugar-coated contempt. "It'll only take a second, Eleanor. We've even marked the spots for you. Just a little signature here and here." She held the pen out to me, its smooth metallic surface gleaming under the lamplight. They were so confident, so dismissive. They were treating me like a child, a dotty old woman who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of such matters, who would simply do as she was told. Their condescension was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket they tried to wrap me in. This was the inverted confrontation the moment they believed they were in complete control. They were guiding a frail, forgetful matriarch through a simple formality before they could cash in their inheritance. They were utterly blind to the reality of the situation, their arrogance, their greatest and most fatal weakness. I looked from their expectant faces down to the papers they had placed on the small table before me. My years as a court secretary had trained my eyes to see past the surface of official-looking documents. I recognized the dense legal jargon immediately. It was not a tax form. It was a quitclaim deed, a transfer of ownership. They were asking me to sign away my home. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, a quiet, profound moment of power that they misinterpreted as confusion. I could see the impatience flickering in Tanya's eyes, the faint tightening of Michael's smile. They thought I was hesitating, lost in a fog of old age. They were waiting for me to comply, to scrawl my name and seal their victory. I let them wait. I let them sit in the comfortable certainty of their own deceit for a few moments longer, savoring the quiet knowledge of the reckoning that was about to unfold. The air grew heavy. The ticking of the clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, counting down the final seconds of their illusion. I met my son's gaze, and for the first time in a long time, I did not look away. I held it, letting him see the calm, clear depths of my resolve. He was the first to falter, his smile wavering under the weight of my silent, steady stare. I did not take their pen. I did not even glance at it. Instead, I looked them both directly in the eye, holding their gazes with a lifetime of disappointment. I said nothing. The narrative of my actions shifted to short, sharp, staccato sentences. Calmly, I reached down. My hand went to the worn leather handbag resting by my chair. My movements were deliberate, unhurried. I unclasped the bag. I reached inside. I pulled out the official notarized documents from Walter's office. The certified copy of the original deed. the legal notice of the lien. I placed the papers on the table directly on top of their fraudulent quitclaim deed. The sound of the thick legal-sized paper hitting the polished wood of the table was the only noise in the room. It was not a loud sound, but it was a sound of absolute finality, a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. Tanya and Michael stared at the documents. Their practiced smiles faltered, then dissolved completely. I watched them scan the papers, their eyes darting back and forth. They saw the official embossed seal of the state of Vermont. They saw the letterhead from the law office of Walter Benedetti. And they saw the name typed in bold official ink, listed as the sole and undisputed owner of the property. In question, Eleanor J. Warren. Then, and only then, did I speak. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It carried the simple, unshakable weight of absolute authority. This house, I said, my words clear and cold as a Vermont winter morning, is still mine. And it will remain mine. The truth landed between them like a physical blow. The color drained from Tanya's face, leaving it a sickly, pale mask of shock. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked from the papers to me and back again, her mind refusing to process the reality before her. Michael just stared at me, his expression one of utter, dumbfounded disbelief. He was looking at his mother as if for the very first time, not as a frail, dependent old woman to be managed, but as the immovable, unshakable foundation of the very life he had so casually tried to sell. Their grand plan, their future villa, their boat, their entire deceitful, glittering world built on a bedrock of disrespect and greed crumbled into dust in that single silent moment. It was all undone by a simple piece of paper, a fact, a truth they had forgotten, a history they had tried to erase. The pile of wood on wasted land was, it turned out, a fortress. And I was still its queen. Their house of cards had fallen, and all it took was the quiet whisper of the truth. They had gambled everything on my weakness, and they had lost everything to my memory. There was no argument. There was no shouting match. Their defeat was absolute, and it was silent. I stood up, my movements no longer slow or frail, but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I looked at my son, at the stranger wearing his face, and delivered the story's core moral lesson with a quiet, dignified finality. This home, I said, my voice filled not with anger, but with a deep and sorrowful clarity, was built on love and sacrifice. It was not built on greed. If you cannot honor its foundation, you do not deserve to stand under its roof. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked to my room, retrieved the single suitcase I had arrived with months earlier, and walked to the front door. I did not look back. I called a taxi from my old flip phone, and as I waited for it at the end of their long, manicured driveway, I felt the cool Vermont air on my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The peaceful epilogue of my story began the moment I stepped back across the threshold of my own home. The house was dusty and still filled with the faint, sad smell of a place left empty. But it was my place. I opened the windows, letting the fresh, pine-scented air chase away the stale silence. I spent the next few days in a quiet ritual of reclamation. I polished the old wood until it gleamed. I washed the curtains and hung them back in the windows. I tended to the neglected roses in the garden. The work was hard, but it felt good grounding. It was the work of restoring not just a house, but a life. It is not a grand or luxurious home, but it is a sanctuary of peace and dignity. My favorite teacup may be gone, but the memories it held are still here, safe within these walls. My story is not one of revenge. It is one of restoration. It is a reminder that truth, like the deep roots of an old tree, endures. And now I speak to you, to the women who might be listening to this, the ones who have been made to feel like a guest in your own life. Hear this: your worth does not expire with age. Your value is not tied to what you can do for others. Kindness is not an invitation for cruelty, and your silence is not consent. Do not wait for them to forget who you are to remember it yourself. Keep your name on the deed. Keep your name on your dignity. Because some foundations are not meant to be sold. They are meant to be honored. And you are the foundation. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stirred something inside you, if you've ever felt like your voice was being silenced, then know that you are not alone. This is a place where every quiet woman has a story, and every story deserves to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge True Stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of truth and restoration.